And so it's a metaphor, first of all, to help us to take a fresh look at the big, obvious, scary things coming at us, and to remind us that we're much more likely than we think to take our eye off of them and to get trampled, but we're not condemned to do so.
This is Andrew Vance, and you're listening to Choose the Hard Way, where I explore lessons learned at the limits of human experience with top performers from tech, business, the arts, science, the military, and many other disciplines. Go to choosethehardway.com to sign up for our newsletter. And if you enjoy this episode, please subscribe and give us a 5-star rating in the iTunes store. If you'd like to suggest a guest or be in touch, you can email me at choosethehardway@gmail.com or reach me on Instagram at hardwaypod. There aren't shortcuts or hacks on the road to becoming the best. You are what you overcome. Choose the hard way. What does risk mean to you? How do you manage it? Is your relationship to risk something you can transform? Michele Wucker is the author of 4 books, including The Gray Rhino, How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore. Her new book is You Are What You Risk, the new art and science of navigating an uncertain world. Michele is a Guggenheim Fellow and former president of the World Policy Institute. Our conversation covers risk anticipation, risk management, and risk mitigation strategies for individuals and organizations, and much more. You can follow Michele on Twitter at Wucker, that's at WCKER, and learn more about her books, and her business at Wucker.com and thegrayrhino.com. That's the Gray Rhino with an A. You can find those links in the show notes. You know, I don't normally break the fourth wall here on Choose the Hard Way, but Michele, I was sharing with you before we started recording just now. I'm in the middle of a very high wind storm. It's a windstorm. I guess it's just gale force winds, and that was leading to the windows here really severely rattling, and I deployed a best-in-class fix. I have duct taped the windows to the window frames. I believe this is what Terry Gross does during interviews if she starts to get window rattle. So
getting too much fresh air.
yeah, exactly. Too much fresh air. You just can't get enough, but sometimes you can. So I know we talked about this a little bit before, but just to get into it a bit more directly, what is a gray rhino?
So the Gray Rhino is the big scary thing that's coming at you. Think of the horn as dangerous, the 2 tons, very big, coming right at you. And it's gray because in the wild there are black rhinos, which is an official species, and white rhinos, which is also an official species, but neither one of them are the color that they are. They're actually both gray. And so it's a metaphor, first of all, to help us to take a fresh look at the big, obvious, scary things coming at us, and to remind us that we're much more likely than we think to take our eye off of them and to get trampled, but we're not condemned to do so. So it's really a way to get people to focus on these big things coming at us that we're not prepared for. It's a contrast. It's got 2 cousins. The black swan, which is the thing that's so improbable you can't even think of it.
The good old black swan, very popular, right?
Very popular in finance and policy, and very badly misused. I think the good intention was to expand your imaginations, to create more resilient systems, and maybe to invest in the author's hedge fund, but and then you have the elephant in the room, which by definition just stands there. Nobody says anything, nobody does anything, and it kind of normalizes it. And the idea of the gray rhino is that you don't have to do nothing and say something. The gray rhinos are things that people are talking about, and some people actually are doing about. And it's a way to ask yourself why some people see the big scary thing coming at them and do something about it, and why other ones don't, and which one of those are you and your organization, and why, and is that really where you want to be?
I know that while it's a gray rhino is something obvious, it's often ignored by almost everyone. Why is that?
There are all kinds of reasons.
There's a whole book about it, right? But
a whole book about it.
But yeah, like what psychologically, what is it about people that makes them not want to pay attention to obvious things, I guess?
Well, there are a bunch of cognitive biases. Our brains set up all these little, tricks and structures to protect us, like, denial after a big shock, like a death or something. It actually lets us process that. In fact, forces us to process things slowly so that we can handle it all at once. Because sometimes it's just too big and you would just collapse and have a nervous breakdown if you absorb all at once. So some of it's defensive, and other things help us to focus. Like if you live next to a train, I grew up in the Midwest in Texas, where you have a hard time not living close to, at least within earshot of a train.
Sure.
And you learn to just block out certain things so that you can focus on the most important things at hand. So some of these biases have good purposes, but you need to be aware of them. Another one is groupthink and related confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is that you pay more attention to the things that confirm what you already know. And then that gets to be even stronger in a group where everybody's coming from the same perspective. They went to the same school, they work together, they read the same books, they know the same people. And it becomes socially very, very difficult to say something that bucks the trend. So there's those things. There are other incentives, like, in companies, particularly publicly listed companies, you've got quarterly earnings, and people in the stock market are watching those all the time. And so there's a big incentive to focus on short-term results, even though the cost is maybe you'll have some really bad long-term consequences. CEO pay, political cycles, there are a lot of incentives to push things down the road. And then more recently, I've taken a much, much deeper dive into the social psychology of this.
Right.
Because it's not the same for everyone. There's been such great work going on in behavioral economics about, we have loss aversion. Once you have something, you don't want to lose it, and you'll bet more to hold on to the thing you have than something else. But that's not the same for everyone. And so each person has their own mix of their sort of innate personality and their experiences, the good and bad things that have happened to them, their environment, their habits, their organization, general cultural values, a sort of policy environment. And all of those things together help to influence how you see a gray rhino, whether you deal with it or not.
Right. And I guess that kind of brings us to the new book, You Are What You Risk. But I'm really curious, before we go there, in the process of writing the Gray Rhino and subsequently all the work that you did following that, did you learn anything about yourself or from the process or from the concept that perhaps was non-obvious before, that just was kind of hiding in plain sight for you as a person?
Yeah, absolutely. I looked at how much my own relationship had changed with risk over the years. And, how my environment had a lot to do with that. I was an overachieving kid who, skipped 2 grades. And there are certain things that are expected of you. And I guess they say that overachieving kids really, have a strong desire to please people around them. I don't know if that was my case or not. I often, bucked what I was told to do. but early on in life, the biggest risk was not doing what's expected of you. And as life went along, I learned that the bigger risk was not taking care of your health and of not being true to what you're really here for. And that, I hear that, and it reeks of privilege in a certain way. There are a lot of people who don't have the option of really doing what they really, really want to do. And right. in my case, it's kind of a blessing and a curse. It's if I'm not doing what I feel I'm really supposed to be doing, I kind of, I crumble, I lose energy, I lose focus, I just can't do it. And so, that also taught me about this relationship between risk and purpose and the choices that you make. And sometimes the biggest risk, it looks like a risk to other people, but to you, it's not even really a choice, because the gap between that choice and the next one is so big that it's not so much of a choice, and risk actually is choice. So at some point, whether it's actually a risk or not becomes a murky area.
And as you kind of started to have this concept coalesce around risk for the new book, I guess I'm curious, I'm making an assumption here, but had you already thought of of risk profile and individuals as it relates to the Gray Rhino when you were writing the Gray Rhino, or did this all just kind of come into focus following that, the idea of applying it to individuals and individual risk profiles?
I think I was thinking about it, but I didn't know it. It was deeply subconscious. I was catching up with a friend recently after one of the book events that I did, and she says, I'm so glad that you did this book, because all the things that you're talking about now are things that I thought about when I was reading Gray Rhino and really wanted more of. And so, it was, I think, as subconscious, I spent so many years in finance and policy, and that's who I was. And I spent so many years kind of tamping down the, personal side of who I was. It was all like, workaholic, work. And the personal stuff was, for the birds. But I think it went back even further than that to, when I was in high school and volunteering at a Veterans Administration hospital in Waco, Texas, with a psychologist. And that's when I became really interested in what makes people tick. I mean, both the pathologies and the everyday things. And I left that behind when I realized that if I wanted to go to medical school and be a psychiatrist, I needed to get over this little problem that I pass out when I see blood.
That's no big deal.
No big deal.
Yeah, not at all. You don't have to do that.
No problem.
Yeah, when you're a doctor, you don't have to see blood ever. It's no big thing.
I just figured I would get over it. Like if I powered through it, then I mean, like all these other people are doctors,
Right.
And so I just kind of left that psychology side aside. But I read about it. It continued to be a big interest of mine, and talking with friends, trying to share insights into what they were going through. So I think that the much more personal approach that you are what you risk takes has always been there. And I also think it's hugely valuable because, as we've seen over the last year with the pandemic, you can't separate bigger policy and business decisions from personal attitudes, from who's going to wear a mask or not, to how different people respond to very obvious threats, like say a pandemic. So I'm glad it turned out that way, because I think it's going into territory that doesn't get nearly enough attention.
Right. And in the book, there's this concept of the risk fingerprint, and I could describe it, but I think, you're the author. Could you just briefly talk about like what a risk fingerprint is and like what that means for individuals? I'm assuming organizations have their own collective risk fingerprint as well, which I know is more in the direction of the Gray Rhino work, but what is a risk fingerprint?
So the risk fingerprint, as a person can have it, an organization can have it, a society can have it. It's the collection of risk choices and their origins that identify you to others, but even more so actually define you. This is as distinctive an imprint as a fingerprint left on a glass in a crime scene that the detectives brush all that black powder on. And like a real fingerprint, it's a mix of genetically determined things that you can't change, and experiences and habits and environment. If you want to take the metaphor further, the genetic stuff is the shape of the arcs and the whorls. The experiences are when you cut your finger and it leaves a scar. The habits are whether you're a construction worker and have calluses, or a desk worker who uses lots of lotion and your fingerprint is nice and soft, and sometimes actually very hard. It doesn't even make a very good imprint. And then the environment, you don't think about hands and fingerprints sweating, but they do. And so there's actually a really interesting neurobiological work on the temperature of the room, the food that you eat, whether you're a smoker or not, what your behavior is when you're smoking, the fragrance that you're smelling, all of these completely subconscious influences on your risk decisions and behaviors. And then the broader environment is the values that you and your peers and your family and friends share, the values of your community and your society, whether it's a collectivist or individualist. And then the organizational culture, whether your organization rewards thinking out of the box. Apologies for using a cliche, or whether it's a we've always done it that way kind of business.
Sure.
And then the government policies. What kind of safety net is there? How much confidence do you have that the government is going to step in, say, a housing market crash or whatever? And all of these work together in a feedback loop. And when you look at people's risk decisions as an individual, as a company, as a society, it tells you exactly who they are, just like a real fingerprint does.
Right. And I think anytime you have a concept like this, there's likely the tendency of people who encounter the concept to try to discover whether there is an ideal or optimal type of profile. So in this case, like, is there an optimal risk profile? Like, what is the risk profile of the highest achieving or best individuals, organizations? And then, gosh, like, how could I become that thing? Personally, I don't believe in hacks. I don't believe in shortcuts. I do believe in trying to discover the ways to most highly express those things at which you're great, or to get better at the things you want to be really good at. But when you think about the risk fingerprint in individuals, is it the case that there is some kind of like optimal or best type of risk profile for someone to like be high achieving or to do their very best? Or is it about people making the most of who they are and what they have? Like, how does that work?
I think it's about finding a good match between your own risk personality and the situation that you're in. I talk a lot about a tool called the risk type compass, which is based on the big 5 personality types, and how anxious or calm you are, and how methodical or impulsive. And there are 8 risk types, and then it also measures how closely you hew to any one of those 8 types. Like if you're just dyed in the wool, carefree, or if you are adventurous, or if you're any of the other types, are you just stuck in that, or do you sometimes show some of the other more conservative traits? And the question is whether you're acting true to your personality type. You can almost have risk dysphoria if you're
right.
In a job or a position where you're expected to make risk decisions that are not in sync with how you approach things. If they want you to make a split second decision and you're really much more methodical and need more time, then that's going to cause some friction. And the other thing is that in a lot of jobs, you'll see a concentration of particular types, like air traffic controllers or accountants or engineers or actors. Jeff Trickey, the guy who created the risk type compass, talks about how actors are they're intensely focused and anxious about risk, but they will do whatever it takes. Like often they'll have terrible stage fright, but they're completely focused on what's going on, and they're so intense, and they get up there, and that intensity is part of why we're so fascinated by them. So I think it's a matter of mindfulness, self-reflection, understanding your risk fingerprint and how it got there. And then once you understand that, you can surround yourselves with the people you need to help you to, make up for your weaknesses and really let your strengths shine. You can develop some of the habits, regularly getting out of your comfort zone. Risk is like a muscle. You actually have to practice it. So it starts with understanding the risk fingerprint. And from there, you can go to the kind of habits, behaviors, and environments that can help you to optimize your relationship with risk.
Yeah, perhaps out of scope for the book, but to take the example with actors, I think, because when you talk to high performers in any field, there often is a state of high arousal, which happens prior to performance, particularly if the stakes are extremely high. And I think some high performers are able to internally categorize that or experience that as, this is just a state that I experienced prior to peak performance. There are other people for whom that's actually incapacitating anxiety to the point that they just don't want to do the thing, even if they're great at the thing. So I guess, I wonder if it's possible for people to remove that step and then just have a different relationship to risk over time so that they can then move into simply having the behavior or outcome they would like without having that potentially painful experience?
Well, I think it's a matter of understanding also what makes you comfortable. One of the things that was surprising to me in the book is that, I talked to athletes, a couple of athletes, extreme athletes, with records for ski jumping and crossing the South Pole and things like that.
Right.
And what was fascinating to me about those people was that we have a stereotype of them is that they just love the adrenaline and the thrill of the risk and all of that. And I mean, yes, Mark Pollock, the adventure walker, who's now trying to find a cure for paralysis in our lifetime, he said, yeah, without the possibility of loss, then you don't have as much pleasure. So there's certainly an element of that.
Sure.
But these people train. They study the terrain. They study they test their equipment. They do everything they can to minimize the risk. They're actually quite methodical about a lot of these things.
Absolutely.
So even though we think of them as these, crazy daredevils, it's not quite that simple. And it's a great example of how the very act of observing a risk and thinking about it and responding to it actually changes the nature of the risk itself. I mean, it's much riskier for someone to go and do base jumping without, any training and not the right equipment and not the right coaching.
Not recommended. Yeah.
Lots of wind. I mean, like, that's stupid. But someone who goes and changes all of the conditions to make it safer, like the opening anecdote about Annie Edson Taylor, who was the first person to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel.
Right.
She had this souped up pickle barrel. It was all, padded, and she sent her beloved cat over the falls to be sure that that the cat made it, as far as I can tell. And she did all these tests, and she really tried to do everything she could to control the situation, and that question of control is actually very important in risk. Like, the more we feel we control a situation, the less risky we see it as being. And that can be dangerous because sometimes people try to control a situation so much that paradoxically they increase the risk. Like, you need a certain amount of flexibility and ability to deal with uncertainty to make risk work for you.
Right. Yeah. So I would imagine in that instance, it's retaining that elasticity. If someone is like really plan things out, they very methodically approach managing risk, which makes sense for high performers in any situation. Just like control what you can, but also be aware that you're going to encounter things you cannot control or that things might go sideways. And then in that moment, retaining the ability to manage risk as it unfolds at a very rapid clip, right?
Absolutely. And the relationship between risk and uncertainty is absolutely fascinating. The classical definition of risk versus uncertainty is that risk is something that you can quantify. You can assign a probability to it, whether through actuarial tables or the weather forecaster. They've got some basis for the predictions that they make. And uncertainty is when you have absolutely no idea. And in real life, people who think they're uncomfortable with taking risks may actually just be uncomfortable with uncertainty, because for most people in everyday life, that probability element is really problematic. First of all, people have very different definitions of what probable is. I mean, I have friends who, if they see a 30% chance of rain, they'll take that umbrella. And there are other people who they're like, 90% chance, there's a 10% chance, that it won't. And then there are other people who say, well, if I take an umbrella, it'll guarantee that it won't rain, which is a whole other level of
right.
of weird. But some people need a higher level of confidence in probability than others. And, I was having lunch with a friend we'd just been at a big conference in Sweden about global catastrophic risks. These things that we know are low probability but huge impact. And some of them actually high probability. They include climate change, which actually I think is very high probability because we're experiencing
Sure.
consequences now. But, nuclear weapons and, downside of geoengineering and things like that. And my friend said to me, I have a really hard time with this idea that you multiply risk times impact. So that even if something's super low risk, if it's a big enough impact, you need to deal with it. He said, for me, risk is binary. He's like, either it's going to happen or it's not. And people have a very hard time dealing with that big gray area between how likely it is something's going to happen or not. Or like I get asked a lot about the possibility of an asteroid hitting the Earth. There's a big article in the New York about it, and I would say maybe 2015 when I was writing the Gray Rhino. And, it's happened before. I mean, we've all heard the stories of the extinction of the dinosaurs. And it was several months ago, we had a smaller asteroid that was coming close to Earth that people were watching. And, the scientists say it's pretty much a certainty that an asteroid is going to hit the Earth, possibly in a catastrophic way. When? Nobody has any way of knowing that. And the other thing is, okay, what are we going to do about it? You look at some of the estimates of what it would take to head off an asteroid of that size. And there's pretty much nothing we can do about it.
Don't you just put Ben Affleck and Matt Damon on a rocket? Isn't that how you get rid of an asteroid about to hit Earth?
It would make a great movie.
Yeah.
You think?
Yeah. But no, I mean, like, that's a wild example, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so many other things that, people got completely different ideas of how risky something is, of how likely something is. And that depends on two different really interesting sets of things again. Partly your personality and your experiences. And then on the other hand, the nature of the risk itself. And that goes into also like public messaging about it, how much control you think you have over it, whether you have a choice in accepting it or not. It's like this whole mask debate. Some of the people who want to just take off their masks, even though it's not safe, they might even have the exact same perception of the risk of getting something, but they so badly want control of the situation and want to feel like they took this risk on voluntarily, which is what taking off your mask symbolically says, that they do something that ultimately might not be so wise. And so, you also find that the different groups of people with different sets of experiences have different responses. It's why we saw so much more mask wearing and quicker responses to the pandemic in Asia, where, of course, mask wearing makes sense. And, I went to Japan for the first time in 2008. And I had this great idea that I was going to go during cherry blossom season, because that's what you do, right?
Sure.
Didn't really think through the seasonal allergy part of that equation. As you can tell, like throughout my life, I've had moments of like extreme risk blindness, seeing blood and becoming a doctor, things like that. So anyway, all of a sudden I was like, oh, this mask thing is so smart. This is the most brilliant thing ever. And of course I came back from Japan and tried wearing masks, during the next allergy seasons. And I got so much stink eye. I was like, okay, forget it, and now, of course, I can wear the mask, and we've got beautiful blossoms out right now, and I'm feeling a certain amount of gratitude for that. But it's also social attitudes about risk. If the people around you think that wearing a mask is a sign of respect for the people around you, and respecting the people around you and being part of a community is good, then you're actually much safer than if people think that wearing a mask is for libtards, and not wearing one is for macho men. It's a really fluid situation, and your risk depends so much on the risk attitudes of the people around you. And then on the flip side, your risk decisions also affect the people who love you, and also the people who don't love you, who you're riding the train with.
Yeah, so many factors go into a risk fingerprint. It's highly complex, it's dynamic, it's a differential equation. And I'm wondering, as you went through the process of writing this book, how did your relationship to risk and risk management change, if it did? Like, did you learn anything that changed how you personally approach risk?
Yeah, I look back at some of the risk calculations over my life and became aware of the times when I had been so just utterly risk blind. Thought, oh, hey, I might have made that financial calculation differently. I might have paid more attention to the downside. And And then one of the big insights actually came from taking this the risk type compass test. I came out as mildly intense, which I just love. It's such an oxymoron. But it means that, I have a certain amount of anxiety and emotional response to risk, but that I also put a lot of attention, to it, so that, in a certain sense, I'd be more methodical, and
right.
And I often will over prepare myself so that when a situation comes up, I can make a decision really quickly.
Almost like an extreme athlete.
Weirdly, yeah. I
right?
didn't think about that, but you're right.
Yeah.
And the mildly, so the intense is the type, and then the mildly means that I'm towards the center. They call these axials, which means those are the people who kind of relate to the other sides. And I'm like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And I also looked at the risk attitudes of the people around me, and I realized how upset I get in a situation when things are unsafe. And, being intense about risk, and we'll look at what I write about and what I do, I'm the person who raises my hand and says, hey, we need to do something about that. And I actually get very upset when we don't do something.
Damn. We can talk about Legos later, okay?
No, Dad, I don't want to talk about.
Okay. I'm in the middle of doing something. Can I talk to you in a little bit?
No.
You're supposed to not be here.
Dad, stop.
Okay. Sorry, Michelle.
It's adorable.
Yeah.
Dad, look what
Okay.
I found
What have you got?
in my playroom.
Oh, wow.
Legoland thing.
That's Legoland. Can you go show it to Mimi, maybe? Will you shut the door behind you, please, pal? Sorry, 1 second. All right.
It's okay. It's peak 2020-21.
Yeah, this is just part of being a super professional. Duct tape on the windows, and my son telling us about Legoland, which I'm glad he did. It looks really lovely.
It's actually cute. Well, the funny thing, my dog used to often, when I first started doing a lot of stuff on the computer, she'd come in and she'd be like, "Grrr, scary monsters in the computer." And and then she'd come in and she's just like, "Okay, I want them to say hi to me." And now she completely ignores it. And then I have a standing desk now. And so now, she's too heavy for me to lift up anyway. So, but there's a class at NYU that I often talk to, and they started asking for the dog.
Oh, yeah.
So now I'm afraid I would have to disappoint them, and maybe I'll get like a little doggy step stool so she can.
I'd recommend a ramp or agility ladder. I'm sure she can master it, and could become part of your background, perhaps next to the plant.
She's actually very clumsy. I thought about taking her on agility classes, and I was like, no, I want to set her up for success, and that's really not the way to do it.
Well, it sounds like you know her risk profile pretty well.
She's adorably clumsy, but
yeah. Yeah, everyone and every animal has their gifts. Now that you've been through the experience of writing this book, do you have a sense of where you're headed next, or do you have the seed of whatever your next idea might be, or are you just kind of sitting in this, absorbing it, synthesizing it, and you're going to run with this for a while? What are you thinking?
It's going to be a while till I can just do the sit thing. And the first thing is, every time I write a book, I tell myself, all right, next time you think about doing a book, remind yourself of how just all-consuming and stressful and awful and, it is. And, just remind yourself of that. Well, since this is my fourth book, you can tell how much I listen to myself. But because, a lot of authors don't realize that writing the book is obviously a huge undertaking. But then the kind of, getting it out there takes a lot of effort. And for me, I really don't want my books to be the kind of books that just sit between the two covers. Right. I really want them to come alive. And actually, You Are What You Risk is very much the result of that process. When I was going around the world talking about the Gray Rhino, people kept asking me, how do I apply this to my personal life? And, why was this such an instant hit in China? And it's been a much slower build in the West. What are those cultural differences? What is this relationship between, personal and professional and policy risks? And all of the questions that are at the heart of You Are at the Risk came from that ongoing engagement with the Gray Rhino concept. And I'm still involved in that Gray Rhino conversation. So for me, it's really a matter not just of writing the book, but having it have impact in the world, of helping people to apply it to their lives, of helping organizations to apply it to make better decisions, and to help policymakers to make better policies that leave us all better off. So it's, the book is just part of a much bigger conversation. Sure. And, we'll see where it takes me. I was very, very surprised at where the Gray Rhino led me. I didn't think it would lead me to something so personal, even though it goes full circle to early days of my career when I was very interested in psychology. So I actually feel very good about the way that following these unexpected directions actually took me full circle. And I like to think that that's an example of a good, healthy relationship with risk and uncertainty, having a good combination of clear purpose, where you're going, and not being as concerned with exactly how you get there, and having confidence that the different paths will get you to where you need to go, even if you have no idea whether it's going to be direct or lots of twists and turns.
Sure. And I mean, being the creator of the Gray Rhino concept, how frequently are you taking a look at your own life, environment, relationships, professional life, to examine whether there might be just like a Gray Rhino obviously sitting there, or something that would be really interesting to pursue or to examine further, or useful, that might just be sitting there? Is that something you do regularly? Like, do you have a practice of doing that? And like, how do you do it, if so?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't have a calendar, but it's more responding to certain feelings. I do try to ask myself regularly, okay, what's the Gray Rhino? And there are a couple of big Gray Rhinos that I constantly wrestle with. I mean, the biggest one is this, relationship between professional life and personal life, and, health, and this drive to keep pushing forward, because I know that I'll get myself sick if I don't listen to, reason and kind of pull back. So, I mean, that's an ongoing one for me. I mean, right now, this dog situation in the building is the big Gray Rhino. I'm right now trying to decide where I want to live for the next 20 years. And, moving in here was an experiment to see if this type of building would work.
Right.
And so, but I do try to ask myself, and I ask people to ask themselves that a lot too, and to think about them in different areas. Obviously, if I'm doing a corporate workshop, it's, generally, business issues, and they often will have a couple of them just clearly in mind. And sometimes they'll come to me for help with a particular one, where we'll take this 5-stage framework and help them to analyze what the best next steps are. But on the personal side, it can be anywhere. I mean, health is a huge one. Mm-hmm. Finances, huge one. Relationships, also big. Adventures. Some people in their leisure time like to take big adventures and go skydiving and stuff. It's not really my thing. My risks tend to be in, the professional area. Like, writing a book that doesn't fit neatly into any one genre is a huge risk in publishing. But it's one that I spent a lot of time talking to my agent and to my editor about, and sent the book out to a lot of beta readers to get their responses, and I felt it was the book that I needed to write. And so that's where I take my big risks, and then try to be very, very systematic on the health side. I mean, I have celiac disease, which means that pretty much every meal is a risk. Right. That's why people with celiac disease tend to reduce eating out by about 90% when they're diagnosed. If we eat gluten, which is from wheat and barley and other things that have them, which is a lot more than you would think, we get very, very sick, and increased risk of cancer and all of this stuff. And so that's an ongoing issue with me. So I'm very, very careful with my health. I maintain a very, very strong network of friends and people who I love and who I know love and support me. And, so that means I've got a certain sense of safety there, which means I can take the professional risks that I do. And I also have this strong sense of purpose guiding me in the professional directions that I take.
Yeah, and that's amazing to find that harmony between what you do, what you love, and to have that network of people in place that actually requires like a lot of work in a very positive way to build and develop over time. But to have that supporting you, it's got to be an amazing foundation to do more of what you love. And that makes me think about, what do you love the most about what you do? It encompasses so many different things. So what gives you the most pleasure of all the different aspects of what it takes to do your work?
So, I'm terrible at favorites. And what do I love the most? I like stress out at that question. Whenever anyone asks, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite this? I'm like, there are things that I do regularly that I love a lot. But, to me, I stress out at that question, actually. But
very mildly intense response. Yeah.
There are a couple things. I mean, I love pulling together things and combinations that people might not have thought of. I mean, it's why you'll see, literature and economics and sociology and anthropology and a dozen other fields in my book all woven together, because I think that holistic approach is really important. It's really hard, but it's how I think, and this sort of complex, dynamic approach to the world, I think, is something really valuable. And the other part is that when I hear people tell me that I have helped them see something differently, or change their life. There was a banker in China who told me that because of the Gray Rhino, she got a company to pay back a loan early, not too long before they went bankrupt. And I was like, whoa. Or, one of the things I do on the side is I'm a mentor editor for the Op-Ed Project, which is a fantastic social enterprise to improve the quality of public debate by increasing the number of voices that aren't heard. I work with those mentees, and they get published in the New York Times. They get published in places. There are articles that actually impact the world, and I get so excited. Or I hear senior officials around the world using my work. There were 9 U.S. senators who last year wrote a letter to the chairman of the Federal Reserve saying, if you don't deal with climate risk pricing, we're going to get run over by another Gray Rhino. And like that kind of, putting my ideas to work in real world situations that could leave us that much better off.
Right.
Just that's really amazing. That impact. So that's really what I do it for.
Thanks again for taking time to connect, to talk about your work. And if people want to learn more about your work, they can go get your books, obviously. But is there anywhere else they can go to learn more about you?
Yeah, I've got 2 websites, Wucker.com, WUCKER.com. That includes my earlier books and my more like writerly side. TheGrayRhino.com, Gray with an A. Has more about the workshops that I do and the speaking and the more business and policy applicable sides of my work. You can follow me on Twitter at Wucker, WUCKER, and I've got a sometimes more regular than other times column on LinkedIn, so you can find me and subscribe there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michele.
Thank you. It's really been so much fun talking with you.
If you have questions, comments, feedback, or want to suggest a guest, please reach out to @HardwayPod on social or email me at choosethehardway@gmail.com. I've had times in my life when I've been in hot pursuit of my dreams and gave up when I hit obstacles I didn't think I could overcome. After more than 2 decades working with the world's top performers, I've learned that to be the best in the world or just find your own personal best, you have to choose the hard way. There aren't shortcuts or hacks that will get you there. And you're going to fail over and over and over along the way. Through Choose the Hard Way, I hope to empower more people to reach beyond who they think they are and just keep going, no matter what they encounter in life, so that they can reach their goals and dreams. You can help me make it happen when you take a moment to subscribe to Choose the Hard Way, leave a review, and rate the show on iTunes or wherever you listen. It only takes 30 seconds. I truly appreciate it, and so will the people who you help to find the show. You can also sign up for the Choose the Hard Way newsletter to get more information about episodes, guests, and other awesome things when you go to choosethehardway.com/newsletter. You are what you overcome. Choose the hard way.